And now on the line is Breda Gahan from Concern. Breda, welcome to the programme.
Hi Darren, nice to talk to you. Nice to talk to your listeners on Near FM, and thanks for taking attention to mark World AIDS Day 2019, which is on December 1st, this coming Sunday. In fact, marking 31 years of World AIDS Day since it was first recognised by the World Health Organization in 1988.
Breda, I last spoke to you on Near FM just over a year ago. We are talking on radio today to primarily talk about World AIDS Day 2019, which is being celebrated this Sunday, 1st of December. Before we talk about that, can you fill our listeners in a bit on what you have been getting up to with your work since we last spoke on radio after last year's International AIDS Conference?
That's right. Yes, Sharon. Well, as you know, Concern Worldwide is focused on extreme poverty reduction, and AIDS is increasingly recognised as both a contributor and a challenge to implementing the Sustainable Development Goals 1 to 17. So Concern integrates and responds to HIV within our sector programs of health, education and livelihoods in the three contexts in which we work: emergency, development and fragile states. Some of the countries have lower prevalence, less than 1%, where Concern is operational, somewhere between 1 and 5%. And in fact, Malawi is the highest prevalence country that Concern is currently working in at 9.2%. So our response tends to be integrated into the national government response in each country. And probably I'm more concerned right now and going into 2020 in terms of the medium prevalence countries where they're under 5% adult prevalence, but greater than 1%, countries like Haiti, Kenya, Rwanda, Central African Republic, and South Sudan, where conflict, risk and vulnerability, especially for women and girls, is a high challenge in those countries, and the services to deliver in terms of testing and treatment are quite weak. So in the health programs, we're supporting through health system strengthening.
I know that UNAIDS have a new CEO. Could you just tell me a bit about that story, please?
That's right. She formerly worked with Oxfam. Her name is Winnie Byanyima. She was appointed in August. I think took up officially just earlier this month. She's a Ugandan, so she knows very well, close at home, the impact of HIV and AIDS in the worst days before treatment. And she launched the World AIDS Day 2019 report just this week titled Power to the People. So I think it's the first time a woman has led UNAIDS, so it's great to see her commitment and focus especially on women and girls who are increasingly infected and affected, especially in Africa, which is still the continent most affected by the HIV epidemic. In fact, 2/3 of the global total of 37.9 million people living with HIV live on the African continent. And that's also the continent where the health systems, again, for effective testing and treatment can be weak, especially in urban slum or remote extreme poor areas where Concern and our DOCUS NGO partners are operating.
There's been a lot of controversy in some news media about UNAIDS over the last while, hasn't there? Do you know much about that?
Well, I've been following it online. I think it's good to be called out where there are issues in terms of respect for staff, but I don't know the case in detail, so it's really difficult for me to comment on what charges were laid. But obviously, gender equality, respect, equal opportunity is important in UNAIDS, in Concern, in Irish Aid, in all the DOCUS NGO organisations. And, you know, we're now in the 16 days of action, started the 25th of November, to end violence and intimidation against women and girls, including up to World AIDS Day and Human Rights Day on December the 11th. So it's ongoing in terms of leading by example. So it's very important that Winnie Byanyima who was in, I think she was in, where did I read? She was in Kenya. Oh, yeah, she was in Kenya when she launched the Power to the People report. And she particularly acknowledged the importance of fighting and addressing inequality and poverty to get ahead in terms of the HIV response. And one of our headlines is, that we must advance women's rights if we're to end AIDS. So our second big step in the race to end AIDS must be to tackle gender inequality.
Okay, you mentioned the report UNAIDS brought out this week. Can you tell us any more about World AIDS Day this year and how it is being celebrated?
Yes, almost every country, including here in Ireland, there are two events this evening. One at Smock Alley, organised by the Irish Global Health Network and Irish Aid, and one later in the evening in Trinity College, organised by HIV Ireland, an interview between Panty Bliss and Gareth Thomas, who recently disclosed his HIV status. Unfortunately for him, he was forced to disclose because the media were going to disclose, which is a violation of his rights. But anyhow, now he has disclosed. He's a former rugby player for the Welsh team, as far as I'm aware. So it is good that leaders and people living positively who are accessing treatment, which means they're undetectable, not able to pass the HIV virus on to anyone else, can speak out globally, because it really is much harder for, young women. Every week, 6,000 young women aged 15 to 24 are newly infected, especially in sub-Saharan African countries. And even in Ireland, we're hearing that women living with HIV are finding it harder and harder to speak out due to intimidation, stigma, and fear of rejection from their peers, work colleagues, and friends. So the theme this year on World AIDS Day is communities make the difference. And I would certainly say, in my experience working 31 years with Concern now and going to countries in Africa, including Uganda, Mozambique, Rwanda, Tanzania, and others, that really it has been communities that have made the difference, especially in the early days before treatment. And people living with HIV networks have been especially important, supporting on awareness raising, education, helping to reduce stigma, supporting people to take the test, now supporting people to stay on the treatment, which is often not easy in countries where Concern is working and hunger is a problem, lack of access to a quality diet, and with the important peer psychosocial support. I mean, stigma is ongoing. I mean, on my last trip in Mozambique, really poor people in a remote area of Manica province, said to me that in their perspective now, it's only very poor people, extremely poor people, get HIV. That richer people know where to get the treatment, they know where to access the services, and they don't have to speak out and be challenged in terms of jumping barriers to access the treatment that is so difficult for people living in urban slums or in remote rural areas. HIV continues to be a major global public health issue, and without organisations, like even in Ireland, previously Open Heart House, I think you went to visit one time, was it, Darren?
HIV Ireland, is it?
Open Heart House. They were there in Parnell Square.
No.
And now,
were they also called Dublin AIDS Alliance? No.
No, but their office was near to there, up on Parnell Square. Dublin AIDS Alliance has become HIV Ireland, but there was a peer support organisation which unfortunately had to close due to lack of funding.
No, I was never there. No.
James used to go there, and other people living positively, and it was a real place for people who are living with HIV to be supported. Since that closed, there is no walk-in place easily available, especially for the psychosocial support and other services. And I mean, there's still no cure for HIV infection. In Ireland here now, I would say ACT UP Dublin are leading the social and community response and helping people to raise issues on access to PrEP, testing, confidentiality, supporting people who are especially marginalized groups, people living with HIV who do not want to tell other people, to be able to access their treatment and stay on treatment. And even in Ireland, it's hard to imagine, but we're in week 47 this week, and there are 10 new diagnoses every week in Ireland, up on the same period last year. That is a lot of diagnoses. Okay, globally, it's unfortunately 4,700 per day globally, but even 10 a week in Ireland is a lot, given that we know how to prevent HIV. I would say the biggest weakness in the response has been on effective HIV prevention.
You mentioned the Father Kelly lecture and the interview with Panty Bliss. Just for the benefit of our listeners, this interview we're doing today is being played on Near FM on World AIDS Day, the 1st of December. And the Father Kelly lecture and the other interview with Panty Bliss is a couple of days beforehand on the Thursday, just for the benefit.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
Just for the benefit of our listeners. Breda, has there been much change on the funding side of the fight against AIDS in the last few years?
Well, thankfully, Irish Aid continues to support the Global Fund and UNAIDS. But in general, the picture is not good, and without sustainable financing, the AIDS response can fail. In 2016, the General Assembly agreed to a steady scale-up of investment, especially in low and middle-income countries taking responsibility, planning to increase to 26 billion by 2020. But at the end of 2018, only 19 billion had been raised. And unless, there is a steady increase, access and coverage for testing and treatment will not match the need. Global financing is still decreasing, and the political commitment of the mid-90s up to the 2000s is not being matched by the financial requirements to end AIDS by 2030, target SDG 3.3. The shortfall is especially alarming for me, because, if people living with HIV are not able to access treatment for life, they will die. There is still no cure for AIDS. And again, it's the poorest, extreme poor, disadvantaged, most vulnerable populations in the context where concern is working that will die. And they won't make headline news. There are statistics in a report. We know how to stop and prevent people living with HIV from dying, but it needs to be matched with the commensurate resources to make that a reality for all people living with HIV. And for, the 4,700 infected today, tomorrow, what's the next day? Sunday, World AIDS Day. I mean, it's still a big burden on the global health budget annually.
The Global Fund had a fundraising campaign a few months ago among governments, I think it was, and they raised the most money in a campaign they've ever raised. You know much about that?
That's right. Yes, they had a replenishment call, and France and Ireland and other donors have stepped up. Canada likewise. So if the longer the Global Fund is funded, absolutely, the more people can stay under treatment and stay alive. But it's an ongoing, like every year, we're coming up to a new year in 2020. I'll be looking at concerned country plans for 2020, the budget soon, to see what allocation and what plans are for responding to health, nutrition and HIV. And it really does depend on annual and commensurate funding in need to stop the epidemic.
Okay.
And poorest countries, especially countries affected by conflict. I mean, like where we're working in some of the medium HIV prevalence countries, are ongoing small, low-level conflicts that often might not make global news, but they're there in Burundi, in Chad, in Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, as you would know, Central African Republic. and conflict undermines health systems and people can die. And health system strengthening has to be part of the response beyond the AIDS medications so that the treatments can be safely delivered by paid health workers to the people who need them. And then the support that's required by people affected. You know, often if it's the head of household, maybe the father or the mother, it's the kids who can drop out of school, not go for health services. All of the SDGs are affected where HIV and AIDS is a big problem in the country. And there's less likely in terms of those countries delivering on the SDGs by 2030. It's only a decade away, starting from the 1st of January.
What do you think we can expect to see, Breda, over the next couple or few years in the fight to try to end AIDS?
I'm hoping that, you know, given the voices of young people on issues, important issues of climate change, human rights, justice, democracy, that young people will also be leading advocates in terms of calling out their government's inaction or lack of appropriate action in terms of the response to HIV and AIDS. And in concern, we're increasingly looking at expanding, depending on resources, responses in terms of sexual reproductive health with young people and adolescents to prevent unplanned parenthood, sexually transmitted infections, HIV, cervical cancer, which is unfortunately increasing in low-income countries also, so that adolescents and young people can increasingly be at the forefront of the response. And community youth leaders, given that communities make the difference, is the theme of this year's World AIDS Day. Young community leaders have a really important role to play.
Okay, do you have any interesting plans, Breda, leading us into next year with your work?
Well, it will be interesting to see the International AIDS Conference next year is in the USA, in California. So it will be interesting to see what the emerging teams are. I don't think they've chosen a global team yet for 2021, 2020, I should say. 2020.
It's on every 2 years, isn't it, the conference?
Every 2 years.
3 years, is it?
2 years.
2 years, sorry. Yeah, 2 years.
So have they given a theme yet? I don't think so.
Okay.
Oh, well, they're typing it increasing resilience. It'll probably have a sub-team later on, but it's being held in San Francisco. And given the politics and the difficulty for some people living with HIV to be able to get access and visa to join the conference, you know, that may be a concern. Let's see what will happen. Thankfully, former President Obama lifted the ban on people living with HIV entering the US. The last time the AIDS conference was in the US was, I think it was 2016. You know, personally, I would rather it was in a low or middle income country where the epicenter of the epidemic is, particularly on the African continent, in terms of highlighting the challenge ongoing. But people bid for these conferences or countries, and it is in San Francisco in 2020.
Okay, you'll be going to that anyway. To come towards the end of the interview, is there any more information you'd like to impart to our listeners before you go?
Well, I would encourage everybody to link in with organisations here in Ireland on hivireland.ie to see where they can be tested, where if they need to go for treatment, speak out about it, seek assistance, know how HIV is transmitted accurately, how it's not transmitted, and know how to protect ourselves. HIV is technically 100% preventable and thankfully increasingly treatable. I mean, even globally, HIV increasingly is referred to as a chronic, manageable health condition. That's for the people who have access to treatment for life. So the key thing is prevention, 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 and have the information before engaging in risky behaviours that could expose one to HIV. Prevention is always best with HIV and every illness. So on this World AIDS Day 2019, I really do acknowledge all the communities and all the local organisations and international organisations and community-based organisations Concern is working with that have made such an effort to respond to HIV since the epidemic emerged in the early 1980s. Without communities and community leaders, we would not be where we are. You know, people made a difference, feet on the streets. I worked in St. James's Hospital in the worst days before I went and joined Concern in Africa, when we had no treatment and everybody died. I can never forget that. So let's not lose ground on the gains we've made and move forward to help the extreme poor and most disadvantaged people in the countries where Concern is working to be able to live their lives positively on treatment if they're living with HIV. So thanks, Darren, for your interest, and I hope you can mark World AIDS Day and maybe get to some of the events here in Dublin tonight at Trinity College, Smock Alley, and City Hall over the weekend.